So, welcome back to our last session of the day with Eleanor Armstrong. So, what a name. Of course, I had to do it. So, she's a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm University, and she focuses on how people learn about science outside the classroom and how space science is, quote unquote, displayed. And also she focused on the impact of space science activities on Earth, which is very much in line with the previous discussion. I mean, part of it at least. And she is co-organizer of the space science in contest program. So I give her the floor.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Firstly, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. This is such an exciting talk to be giving. And secondly, I'd like to thank you all for making it through to the final session of the day. I really appreciate you being here to hear me talk. As just mentioned, I am co-organizer with my colleague Divya Prasad of Space Science in Context. We have an upcoming conference on the 23rd of January. On the 26th of January, 2023. You can find more information about this and where to sign up on Twitter at SSIC Tweets, or we have a website that's just spacescienceincontext.wordpress.com. I also run a design studio with a colleague of mine that's called Exomoan. You can find us on Instagram at In Space No One Can Hear You Moan. And we, in that project, explore ideas about sex, care, intimacy in space. We're working on sex ed for astronauts at the moment as a speculative design project. So I feel like I should have talked about that. It's much more fitting with what we're doing, but I had committed to giving a different talk. So I'm going to give that to you now instead. And this is about where is the place for space? Now, I'm going to, from the off, kind of ruin the punchline of my talk, which is the place for space is everywhere. What you're seeing here on this GIF is every rocket launch site from the dates that you can see in the top left corner. And what you'll notice is as I'm talking, these dots where rockets have been launched into space and into suborbital trajectories are all over the world. Everywhere in the world is a place for space in the contemporary era. And what's important about this is that these are not always the places that we talk about. So what I'm going to talk to you here about is some research that I did last year at the University of Delaware, where I was a postdoctoral scholar with Professor Julie Klinger. And I look at how we think about talking about the places that we do space in. So what does it mean to be doing space? This might be places that we have telescopes. I know we've touched on some of these before. It might be kind of heritage. This is an old telescope that has been kind of fallen apart. We might be doing analog research. So places where we pretend that we're going to outer space, but we're actually researching Earth. It might be debris. I know we had a little bit of a discussion about debris. It might be the control centers where people work, controlling things in outer space. It might be training centers where space flight is being prepared. And it might be testing and developing robotic missions that go into space. And those of you who were part of, and also finally, something that I think is really missed out in this conversation, data centers and the other infrastructures for storing the information that we get back from space. So this might be large scale photographs like the JWST. These are stored in servers somewhere, right? And we don't talk enough about the kind of impacts that we see with data centers that are affiliated with space. And so this, the play of the title of my work, Where is the Place for Space, is kind of a riff on Lisa Messeri's book, Placing Outer Space, in which she talks about how we learn to see places as outer space and we learn to read images of outer space to understand them. And what I'm going to challenge is that we are always taught how to understand these spaces. And so what this means is we're learning to read the infrastructures in a public space. And so what I want to say is there are a couple of really wonderful theorists in this area, particularly Starr and Bowker, who, if you're interested in the ideas of following infrastructures and researching them further, they have some really wonderful work. And they say that we normally notice infrastructures in the moments that they are not there for us. So one doesn't really pay much attention to the road, is their key example, until the road doesn't work the way that it was working before. And in that moment, you're really aware of the infrastructure. And so one of the things that I want to think about is which infrastructures are we talking about when we talk about space? And the corollary to this is the argument that I want to make is like we disappear, we make invisible in public communication of space particular types of infrastructure to do with space. And I'm going to go through and detail how this happens. But the implication of this is that we are learning when we go to these spaces or when we exist in a public domain how to think about the world. Culture is not something that's like inherent in the world around us. It's something that is socially constructed and socially reproduced. And this means that we are all teaching each other how to think about these things as we go forwards. And one of the contexts, which is the specific examples I will give today, is museums. And these are theorized as spaces where publics learn from and think about techno-scientific objects and matters of concern. And so we want to think about like who is going, there's a separate question which is like led here at the bottom, which is who is going to these spaces, who is learning these things. But in this talk, I want to specifically focus on what is being taught. So the data that I'm going to show you is from my doctoral research at the University College London in London. I took 3 galleries in the UK, the Weller Astronomy Galleries at the Royal Observatory, the Exploring Space Gallery at the Science Museum, and the From the Beginning Gallery at the Natural History Museum, all of which deal with aspects of outer space. And what I want to show you is that we selectively don't talk about the places that infrastructure happens in when they are not in places that we want to think about as being part of a global north narrative of success. So the first example I want to show you is that in these 2 examples here, but this is also the case in the Science Museum. So this is from the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. What you might notice is a discussion that talks about the UK's role. So for example, here, the UK Infrared Telescope in Hawaii can peer into the hot dust in the universe, and they have a picture of it, but you cannot see where this telescope is situated. It's abstracted from the surrounding setting of the top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii. And when we see a picture of astronomy researchers in Hawaii, which is this top image, you'll notice that these are researchers from 1874. And so what we can see is that there is a distancing, a temporal distancing in the top case, where we're pushing research that happened physically in that place, where we're representing it to the past. And there is a geographical distancing. We're removing the idea of a telescope from the context in which this is legible as part of the island of Hawaii in these 2 instances here. Now, this is really important because, as many of you may know, this is the site of a really high tension, particularly at the moment. Since 2019, there's been protests by Kanaka Maoli, or indigenous Hawaiians, against the use of the Mauna Kea summit for telescope basis. This is a paper, this is a quotation from a listserv that's quoted in a paper from 2020 that discusses exactly why this is problematic. And I want to, since producing this presentation, there's also been a really wonderful paper by Ohakia Maile, which came out in 2021. It's called Cruising Mauna Kea, which is a really wonderful paper of exploring the situated protest that's happening there. But what we can see in this instance is that we're separating the context in which space research happens and the people from the UK in this context who are doing the research. And in both instances, we're prioritizing in the UK museums narratives about UK researchers. Now, this is sometimes done in a kind of way that engages people in museum contexts, where you're showing people who might be like them. But what we are seeing here is that we are particularly reproducing colonial structures, recreating these ideas of centers and peripheries that reinforce to the visiting publics in London who are going to these museums that the people who are scientific, that the people who are doing this research are the UK people who are involved in these projects. And so we are creating this focus on global north researchers, global north work, at and over any research that is done by local communities or other kinds of work that might be happening in these places. So the second example I want to just talk you through is this example from the Science Museum. This is the display of the Black Arrow rocket. You can see it kind of hung in the ceiling of the gallery down here at the bottom, and then I've put an image of the description that comes with the gallery on the center row. And I've just reproduced a small bit of it that I think is the important part, which says, the Black Arrow was Britain's first and to date only satellite launch vehicle. Its design was based on the Black Knight test missile. It successfully launched the X-3 satellite on October 28, 1971. And this is the main description of what this object is and where it is happening. What we do not see in this at all is the fact that this rocket was launched in Woomera, Australia, and not in the UK at all. If you were reading this and you did not know, I truly believe that this instruction is meant to make you believe that this is a UK like native thing, and it doesn't discuss the fact that this is taking place in Australia. It does, around the corner on a very small plaque that is like actually very hard to read, say that this took place in Australia, but this is the plaque that is right in the center of the gallery. It's the one that is close to the model of the rocket, and it is not the one that is hidden away around the corner. There's a very particular idea within this space about who was working on this rocket, what the important features of it were, and those tend to center and prioritize the UK. This means that we can kind of pretend when we do introduce the ideas of these spaces. So for example, when we do talk about Woomera, that these are empty places. They are places with no culture, no context, no peoples living there. And this is actually not only the case in Woomera, but it's been theorized elsewhere. For example, this quote that I've got from the Parkington et al. Paper is actually about the square kilometer array. And they describe how the square kilometer array is narrativized as being something that takes place in a dry and sparsely populated, but not entirely empty place. And this creates the implication, as they note in the paper, that there is nothing at the site before, during, or after these contexts. We can actually see, for example, the way that this is overwriting histories of people who lived in these places. So observatories that were built in southern Africa, particularly in what is now South Africa, but was then part of the British Empire in the Cape of Good Hope, displaced many existing peoples, and were explicitly part of a project of empire building. And to divorce, I know there was like some discussion about this in the session before, but to divorce the ideas of space infrastructure from geopolitics and from colonial histories is to kind of negate the way in which they were not only part of these projects, but also explicitly tools of empire. And there was a really interesting exhibition that I'm writing a paper on at the moment that was called Astronomy and Empire at the Whipple Museum of Cambridge at the History of Science. But it's covered also in these two papers, a Schaefer paper and a McClear paper, that clearly describe the ways in which space science practices from astronomy through the space age and into our new space age are tools of empire and in the way that they operate. So the final example I just want to talk us through, because I'm aware that I'm running up on the time, is this meteorite that appears in the Natural History Museum. This is the bottom picture, and it's a slice of a meteorite that was found in Mars. And you'll note in the description of the label about where it comes from, it's from Oman in 1999. We also have other meteorites that are cited. This top image is from the Royal Observatories at Greenwich. But what's really interesting is that this opened kind of a whole other project of research for me about where do we take rocks from? How do we think we are entitled to inanimate objects? This is really interesting because we see people taking not only rock specimens from places, but eggs, but living beings, plants, and also cultural specimens that go on to populate the museums of the global north, in particular museums like the Natural History Museum and the British Museum. And these, you can see in this quote that I've got down at the bottom, is the idea that they were taken without permission and without any intention of returning them. It's particularly interesting to me. I know that these talk about kind of earlier like conquests and taking of rocks and other objects during the period that like the British Empire was in operation in a very high key manner. But the rock that's over here is actually from much later, right? 1999 is after, is kind of in the post-colonial era. And what's interesting is that actually a lot of the rocks that the Natural History Museum hold from Oman come from during the period that the British occupied Oman. And they were taken, we must assume, because this is the people who are selling them were part of the British forces in Oman at the time. And then they go on to be auctioning these rocks and donating them to the Natural History Museum. So there is direct influence from the British militarized presence in these spaces to the collection of these pieces of culture. They are astroculture for places like Oman, and the direct exportation of these out of the country into museums such as the Natural History Museum. In fact, the Oman as a country doesn't have astrophysics research sites in the same way that particularly the global north, but London in particular does, and many scientists who want to do research on these rocks that come from the country that they are a part of, and obviously we can talk about geopolitics of countries and things like that at length, have to come to places like London to do that research as doctoral researchers or as postdoctoral researchers without being able to do it in their own country. And this is important because it means we can say a couple of things. Tuck and Yang, who wrote a fantastic paper about colonialism that I recommend to you all, particularly talk about how colonialism and colonial acts recast all of the world, all things as natural resources which are possible to take, exploit, and make into capital without concern for how they might be embedded in local life worlds. And we can see this really particularly with the meteorite that's in the American Museum of Natural History that had an important part in the local community role, particularly around building daggers, and was then taken by a American explorer from Nunavut in Greenland and to the American Museum of Natural History in New York with zero concern about how this was embedded in their local life worlds. And this draws on a longer tradition of how, for example, in the UK, British government officials were told to watch out specifically for things like meteorites, but also for other kinds of specimens that would advance the science of the global north and the metropole, recreating these systems of the center and the periphery, in particularly productive in contexts like India, where 9 Indian meteorite falls were presented to the museum between 1859 and 1870. And these were often given as signs of power and prestige and to buy favor with local officials, and then in turn to buy favor with central government in the UK. And this matters. So why does this matter? This matters because these are not past issues, right? I think we all are probably aware of the fact the Queen died recently, and I think we could really see that. that colonialism is not past in the way that funeral took place, right? And this is part of a larger system where colonial practices are not of the past, they continue today, and they are part of the practice of space science. This happens in terms of the ways that we think about pollution, whose work is covered in pollution. In fact, the picture that I've got down at the bottom is from Algeria. This is high quality pollution around the Algerian nuclear test site that the French ran for an extended period of time. And in the recent past, Saharan sandstorms that have blown dust from this area up to France see this as being a big problem because now there is all this nuclear dust that is covering France and people are receiving the impacts of the tests that were taking place there. But that dust is not of concern to the French public when it is staying in Algeria. And that is is a kind of colonial practice in action. So tracing these wastes, pollutants, debris through these environments, and also the ways that they are being extracted from contexts to produce the space materials. And we also particularly see when we do this, that when we pay close attention to which sites are being talked about and which sites are not, that the sites we rarely ever talk about are those that have really strong links with military complex. Right, space is a key site of the dual use where we see lots of things that are military and civilian practice, but we rarely talk specifically in the UK. This data is about the defense practices and the defense companies that are implicated in the production of outer space, about the sites that have these dual use functions. They are the ones that are more often than not left out. So that's probably more than all I had time for. So thank you for being generous. If you want to follow me online, I'm on Twitter. You can follow our stuff on Instagram. And it's been a delight to talk to you here today. Thank you very much. And I apologize profusely because I am told repeatedly I talk far too quickly. And I definitely did that. So I'm really sorry.
You did, but it's fine. Wrote a very important topic.
Thank you.
And a very overarching. Not even
overview.
Yeah. Topic.
Mm-hmm.
and which is very much in line with the previous panel that we had. And I must say, as I said, I was a Westerner, a European, and a French. And when I arrived in Kourou, it was in February, kind of 32 degrees day and night, and something like 98% of humidity, pure Amazon equatorial climate. And the first thing I saw was a car where it was written European Space Center. And there was something wrong there to have this European thing in the middle of this place.
Yeah.
So anybody would like to react or comment?
Can I react to your comment just now? I've actually just this morning spent the day at the Musée de l'Air de l'Espace, which is really exciting. But they have some very different, so the reason I wanted to emphasize that this is a UK context is there's some really different stuff happening at the museum there. And one thing that I thought was really interesting is they have a lot of information about French Guiana and the rocket launch site there, but kind of at the expense of what the French were doing in Algeria. And so it's often kind of done in a way that's like, well, once we stopped like having Algeria, we had to find somewhere else. And so then we moved everything to French Guiana. And now I'm going to tell you extensively about French Guiana. So it's really interesting to me to see like different ways that this narrative plays out within a colonial history where various different places are used kind of successively. So Algeria and then French Guiana. And the way that's framed in public narratives is super interesting to me.
Actually, there is a department of the CNES, which is putting together historical books about the French space program, both in Algeria, in Guyana, and in Toulouse. Honestly, I haven't read the books yet. I should have for this event. I had no time. But I'm curious to see how they present our, because they went through, it was a little bit like what Davis was talking about, going through historical documents, pictures, interviewing the people that worked there at that time. So I'm curious to see how they deal with the dark side of the moon.
Yeah, and I think we have some researchers over here in the corner that I recognize from my other lives who are doing this kind of research as well. So definitely look out for their work. Maybe catch them in the break.
I have,
yeah. Do you want a microphone so that people can hear you? Because I think that's important. Hang on, wait. I think you have to press the button.
I think empire building is a pursuit that we humans will never walk away from. You know, whether it's Murdoch or Musk. And if you think about what you were saying about how things are erased and narratives dislocated, just a quick anecdote. When I was moving from San Francisco to Mumbai in 2008, the year before, I wrote to Arthur C. Clarke, who's a science fiction writer who used to live in Colombo for many years. He wrote back saying, "It's very strategic, Susmita." I said, "Why do you say that, Arthur?" And he said, in his words, he said, "Everything began in the East and is going back there." And he gave me the example of Chinese alchemists having invented gunpowder. And he said, no gunpowder, no rockets, right? And if you look at some of the history that we studied in school, Tipu Sultan, who was one of the kings in the southern part of India, he was one of the first ones to use rockets in warfare. And I believe, I'm not a historian, but that's how it made its way into England. And I think these are the kind of stories, like Davis was saying in the earlier presentation, we need to sort of capture and share, and with some degree of authenticity and depth and rigor, to recenter the narrative. Right?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And actually, I wrote about this in my thesis. So if you're interested in learning more about this, my doctoral thesis is online. It's called Exploring Spaces. And they have some information in the Space Science Gallery at the Science Museum about the history of gunpowder. But it almost exclusively skips over the ways in which it is used, particularly in this battle with Tipu Sultan, and the way that is actually a big focus. It's interesting because that's a big focus of narratives in the Victorian Albert Museum right across the road. There's a lot of discussion about stuff that's taken at that time by the British, but it's almost completely eliminated in the discussion about space. And it's one of the examples that I give about how we talk about science in such a way that elides the projects that lead to the West being able to be doing these things. So I'm like, yeah, and it's interesting to give it a read. I think, sorry.
There is also, and I'll give you the floor in a second. One thing that I find interesting in your research topic, among other things, when we talk about space imaginaries, we think about what I said at the beginning, looking at the stars and all the satellites and being on a rocket and being an astronaut. We never talk about the infrastructure. And I think the infrastructure is very important. And there are artists in residence program at ESO, the European Southern Observatory, which is in the Atacama in Chile. And what they want is that the artists use the data coming from the telescopes. And mind you, they have all sorts of telescopes there. And when you propose, but you have here an incredible piece of architecture, an incredible instrument, which is also interesting. They don't want to talk about that. And I think that is also the question of what kind of instruments we build and where we build them. And that should be also part of our space imaginaries when we talk about that.
Yes. Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I'll try to articulate what I want to see with a little bit of care because it's a little bit slippery for me. So I have to say that as a French Canadian, I always find it difficult to speak about issues of decolonization in Europe because I think for us, it's not a concept that is far away or is something we co-inhabit with. So I think to come back to the need for new imaginaries, new narratives, and also new timelines, perhaps, to undo the first narrative and things like that. So I'm just wondering, we saw today the need for new archives, the need to tell the history, but did you come across any kinds of techniques or, speculative gestures or things like that that could go beyond the necessity to say, okay, we need people to know the history now? I'm a media scholar, and we have something called media archaeology, where we try to dig into the archive to create new forms of narrative that undo linear history. So I'm just curious if in your work you came across some creative gestures or things that we could find modes of attachment to go beyond.
Yeah. So actually, thank you. This is really interesting. And I one third of my thesis was this kind of speculative practice that allows us to create new narratives. So I ran as a part of my PhD queering the science museum practice. So it was about thinking about how we can talk about queer lives, queer studies, and queer theory within the context of space science and science more generally. And so, I did in that section explore some of the ways in which this is possible. There's lots of kind of ideas about participatory approaches. And there's lots of ideas about kind of returning, authentically returning the agency about creating these narratives to people who are not the quote unquote experts in the field. It's really interesting to me also to think about speculative design projects. This is some of the things that I'm working on in much the same way as the media material. I think I'm contributing a chapter to your book on some speculative design things. I think there are lots of really interesting ways to do this out there. In particular, there's lots of really interesting stuff happening in museum studies. I just want to direct you to one project that I've been involved in that I thought was really interesting called Museum Remix at the University of Cambridge, where they invited people in to take over specific objects within museums and recreate that display in order to foreground a very different narrative about that object. I was working on the project with the Polar Museum, but they run it every year and they invite different groups of people and they have a different focus every year. And I think it's really exciting. It's inspired some work that I'm doing at the New York University in the spring that's called Unearthing the Collection. And it's an anti-colonial approach to mineralogical museums to think about the ways that these narratives take place, both within science museums like this, but also specifically within geological and mineralogical museums, which I think are an analyzed place that we create narratives about colonial supremacy and the entitlement to materials and land, specifically in the decolonial sense.
Sure. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Now press the button. Hello. There's something I just wanted to add or comment on is the erasure of the lived experience that surrounds the infrastructure and the research and the process that's going on. And I think museums, like so many other places, I mean, our everyday life is surrounded by the thing that we have to get through and we have to do. And a lot of the projects I've engaged in, where I've engaged with big science institutions, etc., or museums, people go on their lives and continue with what they're doing because they don't want to muddy the research. They have to get through the work that they've paid a lot of money and a lot of time and attention to. And I completely appreciate and understand that. But there is another component to this, which is the responsibility about understanding what the lived experience is on the ground. And so what I find fascinating is there's a new, possibly a new role to be played for the creative sector. And I don't want to call it science education. I don't want to call it repurposing things for the sake of making the scientists feel better or the museum feels better or the colonials feel better. But it's more about how the creative process and the artistic process of engagement and social engagement can actually start bridging a gap that's really exists.
Yeah.
And as a methodology, I was just wanting to kind of comment on that. And there are several examples. I don't want to share them now, but later I can share with you some stuff, especially in South Africa and in Sutherland, where there's these domes that for so long have reigned over very poor communities. And you need, funny enough, a series of artists to come and fly kites to create the connection between the community and space.
Amazing.
It's bizarre. But yeah.
My supervisor always calls these yes and. She's always like, yes and I have this other idea. And I'm like, thank you. I think these are fantastic approaches and really interesting to see them take place. Something I was thinking about in the kind of like end of my thesis, where I was like reflecting on a lot of this stuff, is also like for whom is it appropriate to have these stories? So I was thinking a lot about this protest that is happening in Hawaii, for example, and about how having that narrative more explicitly within the museum might help people who come to visit a museum to learn about science understand some of the social contexts in which science is taking place. But then there is also the question about like, what is the entitlement that the museum in London would be having to assume that it could be taking some of the protest or taking images or banners or stories from those people and displaying them in a museum in London in kind of an ownership manner, right? And so I think also when we think about these things, it's really important to be critical about the ways in which even the assumption that we can have these things to talk about them in this critical way is itself some like has vestiges of these same ideas as well. So yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting.
Thank you. I think we're going to end your presentation here.
Thank you.